Buenas tardes, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last presentation, Dr. Antonio Duran. I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. I am honored to live and work as a guest in the land of the Southwest indigenous peoples, including the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. I acknowledge and respect the sovereign Indian nations and indigenous peoples. As a Mexicana border crosser, I reflexively honor Native American knowledges and worldviews. And I am humbled to live and reside in these lands. I invite each of you to also acknowledge the lands on which you stand and from where you are connecting with us today. I also want us to recognize that there's deep suffering going on around the country, and that we must not be silent around those issues or ignore them. I want to thank and offer my sincere gratitude to our sponsors who have committed to these semester-long dialogue series. Borderlands and Ethnic Studies program, Chicano programs, the College of Arts and Sciences Diversity Fellows, Drs. Manal Hamze and Dr. Spencer Herrera, LGBT plus programs, and the Southwestern Border Cultures Institute. Muchas gracias. Shukran. Thank you. I now turn it over to my dear colleague and ally in these struggles, Dr. Sophia Puck, Director of NMSU's LGBT plus programs, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you to all the other programs working with us. We have had intersectional programming like I have never seen, and that I am remarkably proud to work with you all on. I'm going to introduce the very great speaker for today. Antonio Duran, he, him pronouns, is an assistant professor at Auburn University in the Administration of Higher Education program. Originally from Phoenix, Arizona, Antonio had the opportunity to attend New York University for his undergraduate institution, thanks to a first-generation college student scholars program. From his time at NYU, he then attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, receiving his master's degree in student affairs and higher education. It was during this time at Miami University that he found his love for engaging in research about minoritized individuals in post-secondary education. He pursued this passion for research by obtaining his Ph.D. in higher education and student affairs from The Ohio State University. Now his scholarship involves understanding how historical and contemporary legacies of oppression, such as racism, heterosexism, and trans oppression, influence college student development, experiences, and success. We're very happy to have him. Let's turn it over to Antonio.
Thank you all so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. I feel extremely fortunate and lucky to have the ability to speak. Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind giving me screen sharing possibilities, that would be wonderful. But I will start off by kind of sharing a little bit about what I will be speaking on for today. So I'm going to be speaking about specifically my dissertation work, which is really representative of kind of the larger body of research that I strive to engage in. And I've titled the talk "Embracing the Intersections: Lessons on Supporting Queer Students of Color." So as mentioned, a little bit about me is my name is Antonio Duran. My pronouns are he, him, his, él. And I am at Auburn University, which rests upon the ancestral homelands of the Muskogee or Creek peoples. And I find it important to share that Auburn as a land-grant institution, and what we know about land-grant institutions is that from their very inception, they have been complicit with Native genocide and with the dispossession of Native peoples from their land. And so I definitely want to take a moment to acknowledge the context in which I'm joining you all from. So to give a little bit of an outline in terms of what I'll be speaking about today, I will give a little bit of an introduction into some of my journey in and through higher education settings and what led me to this particular line of work. Then I'm going to give a brief pause for those of you who are watching in and tuning in to take some time to reflect and perhaps pose any questions. I will briefly operationalize a couple of terms that I'll be using through the presentation before then giving an overview of the findings from the study. And my time with the end will be, I'll offer some implications for student affairs practitioners as well as faculty, and then hopefully engage y'all in some time for questions and answers. So as mentioned, a little bit of my journey is I come from Phoenix, Arizona. Both of my parents are from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. They immigrated here when we were young. And I grew up very much so in a space of surrounded by, other Black and brown people, and in a space where it was largely immigrant communities as well as those from low income backgrounds. And so that is, the context in which I started out my educational journey. And everything really got turned on its head when I was allowed to enter a private high school through a scholarship. And no longer was I surrounded by people who, looked like me. Now I experienced a huge kind of cognitive dissonance when I was surrounded by my peers who were largely white, from largely affluent backgrounds. And what I oftentimes share is that those high school years, I was really angry, and I didn't know why, right? Like, I didn't have the language nor the awareness of why I had been experiencing all of these emotions, whether it was anger, frustration, and kind of guilt. And thankfully, some of that changed when I was able to attend my undergraduate at New York University. So as a first-gen student, as first of my family, both immediate and extended, to go to college, I had no idea what I was doing when it came to the college application process. I applied anywhere and everywhere that I was told to apply to. And that included NYU. And when the time came to make a decision on where to go to college, I was really lucky to have gotten a huge financial support through this first generation college student scholars program, the Bright Scholars at NYU. And I basically said, New York City sounds fun. Mind you, I'd never gone to New York City in the past. So everything that I knew was from movies and from reading. And so the first day, I always say, it was a lot, but then I fell in love with the institution starting the second day. And what was really important about New York University is that it was one of the first times that I was able really to explore what it meant to inhabit, my queer identity, my identity as someone who was Latino and who's Mexican. Especially coming from those educational experiences, especially during high school, where there wasn't that room for exploration, and that caused me to really shut down and feel angry at those around me for the circumstances in which I found myself in. So I frequently say that NYU was exactly what I needed, even though I really didn't know it at the time. I also got extremely involved while at the institution. I became that over-involved student leader who then discovered a passion for helping other college students navigate the higher education environment. That then led me to want to pursue a career in working with and advocating for college students, and specifically in student affairs contexts. And so I ended up applying to a few schools during my master's program for my master's experience, one of which was Miami University in Ohio. I had found such care and love for me and exploratory experiences during NYU that, certainly increased my critical consciousness and helped me explore these formative matters of identity. And I kind of acknowledged that New York City, NYU was kind of built for that work. And so as I thought about, the kind of work that I wanted to be doing in higher education environments, especially around equity and justice, I was very intentional in trying to find extremely different places to do this work in. Hence me going to this really small college town in Ohio for my master's degree. And once again, I found myself at a very historically white institution in which it functions very much so with whiteness undergirding it, as well as, heterosexism, trans oppression, and other forms of marginalization. And so I was in classrooms learning about these theories that were intended to support, to help us support college students, and felt an erasure of the stories that were similar to my own. And so for those reasons, I saw an opportunity to really intervene into what we consider kind of the student development theory canon. In student affairs in higher education, we have this whole body of literature around student development, how students supposedly grow, change, and develop during their time in college as it relates to their cognitive development, their psychosocial development, their social identity development. And yet, as I was reading all of this and learning all this in my classes, I did not see people who looked like me in the curriculum. And that led me to want to engage in this research, especially also because I once again found myself at this historically white institution, and couldn't help but to wonder, what would it have been like if I went directly from my high school that was historically white, right, and functioned as such, and immediately went into Miami University for my undergraduate experience? Would I have had the same kind of opportunities for exploration of my social identities, and specifically my sexuality, my race, and my gender? What would those experiences have been like? And so with all of those questions, I decided to pursue my PhD in higher education and student affairs with this research question in the background. And so I do want to pause for a little bit in case you all are tuning in and watching in. After sharing a little bit about my story, I am interested to learn a little bit, or just to have you all reflect on, what is it that you see as the unique needs of queer students of color? Where do these insights and assumptions come from, right? Are they, is it like me, right, your own personal story of navigating the world and navigating post-secondary education institutions as a queer person of color? Is it through engaging with your students or with fellow colleagues who identify as such? So curious about where the insights are coming from, as well as any questions that you have related to the work of queer students of color. I'm going to try to be as broad stroked as possible in terms of giving insights from the research. But of course, if there are any particular contexts that you would like me to think about and talk about, I very much so welcome that as well. And so giving a brief pause in case anyone would like to put any of this in the chat functions, whether it be through Facebook or through YouTube. And I will certainly be monitoring the chat to see if anything comes up. And we'll find ways to integrate said comments or insights as I speak about this particular study. So once again, what do you see as the unique needs of queer students of color? Where might these insights come from? And what questions do you have related to working with this? And I do see a hand raised, so I'll pause and let you come on in.
Thank you, Antonio. Those are great questions to ask and ponder about it. specifically because of the region where we are located, where NMSU stands. And I'll ask my colleagues to chime in as well. What I find particularly, I guess, painful to speak about is in my class right now, it is a testimonies from the Borderlands course. And there are a couple of students who are LGBTQ plus, and they are writing their own testimonials, and there's fear in disclosing anything that has to do with their sexuality or sexual orientation because of the homophobia in highly conservative and Catholic environments that we may inhabit around here. So that's a little bit about the context here. And this idea of intersectionality has definitely been something that Dr. Pook and I have talked about in terms of how do we serve the whole student, mind, body, and spirit, in terms of not only through student support services, but also academically, like how do we do that? And how do we do that as a Hispanic serving, minority serving institution in the Borderlands region? So I'll let others talk. I know there's a question in the chat from Dr. Lara.
Hi, thank you. It's so nice to meet you. And I feel the positive, happy energy coming from you. And that's just refreshing. And I look forward to learning more about your research and your findings at the different institutions where you're studying students' experiences and support services. But I was just wondering, like, it's great to hear that you're from Arizona by way of Ciudad Juarez. We're here, right, very close to Juarez. And so I'm wondering, like, part of the intersectionality is place-based. And I think Dr. Flores Carmona kind of took the words out of my mouth. It's a very Christian hegemony. There's a lot of sort of cultural expectations here in the borderlands around gender orientation, masculinity. So I look forward to sort of hearing your thoughts on the complexities, including the borderlands, since that's where our institution is. So anyway, thank you. I look forward to learning more.
No, for sure. No, I appreciate that. And definitely, it is important to think about the place and the context, because of course, that's going to shape these questions around identity and exploration. I also see a note from someone watching through the live functions around responding perhaps to this first question, right, of this constant having to explain and justify who/why they are who they are. And so I appreciate this coming from one of the viewers who is speaking as someone who has various family members who identify as part of the community. So thank you for all of these comments and insights. That is certainly something that I'll speak a little bit about this in a bit, but this research was specifically done at historically white institutions, and I have been thinking about the paucity of research on queer people of color within Hispanic serving institutions. And I think that is extremely notable to think about the work that we're doing at HSIs specifically, especially as we're thinking about the degrees of servingness and how we conceptualize serving the Latinx AO population on HSI campus. And so I really look forward to talking a little bit about that. And thank you again for the folks who continue adding things in the chat. I'm seeing, the difficulty of students/family coming out, especially coming from traditional homes, which traditional is frequently regarded as, socially conservative, religiously guided, and then not seeing representations of queer and trans folks and social movements that are hetero and cisnormative. And perhaps also the opposite, right? As we think about our movements towards racial justice and thinking about that as well as thinking about, our queer and trans movements that oftentimes center whiteness. And so it certainly is existent in various communities as well. And so please do continue adding thoughts and questions throughout. I really love hearing from you all in terms of your thoughts and questions. So I appreciate that. And with this, I will kind of turn to talking a little bit about operationalizing two main terms and concepts that I find an important kind of name. And the first being historically white institutions. So as I mentioned, this research is centered in historically white institutions. And frequently we use the language of predominantly white institutions in order to kind of denotate numbers, right? College campuses that have a majority white population. But I do use how other scholars have conceptualized historically white in order to call attention to the historical contemporary racialized infrastructure that's in place, the current racial campus culture and ecology, and how modern institutions still benefit, white populations at the expense of other groups of color. And so when recruiting participants for this particular study, I asked them to self-identify themselves as being within historically white institutions. Because what we know about Hispanic serving institutions and ANAPESES, right, is that they themselves are not exempt from historical and contemporary legacies of whiteness, right? And so from my perspective, an institution can both be a Hispanic serving institution as well as historically white, right? And so there were a couple of participants in this particular study who were at colleges and universities that were not predominantly white, but that they themselves identified as historically white. And so I want to name that while at the same time still calling attention for the need for research that is HSI specific and that very much so keeps in mind this designation and what is done in order to enact, the servingness component that I think HSI scholars and practitioners have been calling attention to. The second term that I like to call attention to is that of intersectionality. And this is a term that we hear quite often in the academy and in other spaces as well, acknowledging that intersectionality has become a traveling theory, meaning it's made its way across disciplines, it's made its way across movements. And so I always like to be very clear about what I mean about when I say intersectionality because of the ways it's traveled and the ways that different people have interpreted the term. And so in my work, whenever I've mobilized intersectional theorizing, I've strove to honor the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is frequently referred to as the critical legal theorist who coined the term intersectionality, while also honoring women of color before or after and after her who have contributed to this broader kind of landscape of intersectional theorizing. And in particular, what I'm about to set up is that my research has largely examined notions of identity and how people have conceptualized identity. But when I use intersectionality in this context, I try to be very clear that I'm not using it to refer to intersecting identities, right? But rather to call attention to oppressive systems and how they overlap, intersect to create a unique sense of marginalization for individuals. Very much so in the spirit of intersectional theorists who have long argued that intersectionality is about how things work and not who people are. And so that is a note that I always like to begin and orient audiences to the scholarship on which I'm pulling from and striving to. And I'm also keeping in mind, there is intersectionality in its way that it's been conceptualized. And I I always see it in conversation with other intersectional work, thinking about like queer of color critique, thinking about the work of queer women of color that wouldn't necessarily, self-label itself as intersectionality, but still does the work of thinking about, intersectional theorizing as well. And so just wanted to quickly operationalize those two terms before then introducing the context of the particular study that I'm naming from. And I'm certainly mindful of the other questions that have come in the chat around, creating better spaces to share without putting a target or maybe causing people to educate, making them speak for all. And then also this question around the experience of coming out and how that may be different for queer students of color. And so as a quick background for the study, as mentioned, I'm a higher ed scholar, so I frequently think in what is it that is happening in our post-secondary education landscape and how things have been changing and evolving. And what we know is that campuses continue to be diverse across a number of different identities. And at the heart of it, the US system of higher education was created and continues to maintain legacies of exclusion, right? And so our higher education institutions have always been a part of and have never been exempt from systemic oppression. And what we know is that even when students have the ability to access higher education institutions, they still face numerous forms of oppression within our college campuses. And yet, right, there's oftentimes this adage that is said by many that college is a time to experiment, college is a time to explore. And so what does it mean for us to label college campuses as a place to explore while at the same time recognizing that students may also continue to encounter experiences of marginalization while in this period of exploration? And the last note around background is, I called attention to this a little earlier when I talked about these theories that I was learning in my classes around college student development. And what I found myself frustrated with at times was that they frequently talked about identity while centering singular identities, right? And that is because this body of literature that we have pulled from in higher ed in my specific discipline are oftentimes psychological. They come from social psychology. And so there's much to be said around theorizing intersecting identities and usually they fail to use a power-based lens, right? So thinking about the ways that, racism is operating on college campuses, heterosexism, trans oppression, the intersections of them, and how that influences identity in the process of making meaning of identity. And so with that, I engaged in this project to understand how queer students of color explored their identities during their time at historically white institutions and tried to understand how is it that, these systems of power influence the process of identity exploration. And so I interviewed 20 queer students of color, each at institutions across the country. And so I try to be very intentional in trying to get people in different regions of the country, at different size of institutions, keeping in mind public versus private, so on and so forth. And try to acquire diversity in terms of, race, sexuality, gender, and other identities, recognizing that the limited research that we have on queer people of color in higher education settings is oftentimes about gay, cis men of color. And so I strove to try to make the sample a little more diverse. And one of the criterion that I always find it important to note is that I did ask that students who are interested in participating would have had to complete at least 2 years at their current institution. And that is because I was extremely interested in learning about how structures, practices, policies at the institution influence their process of identity exploration. And I had made the assumption that if people had spent a longer time at their college or university, that they may be able to speak a little bit more towards the inner workings of the institution, as opposed to those who were simply in their first year and may have just been in the culture and learning about the institution as well as learning about themselves as well. And so I'm not gonna explain this in greater detail, other than the fact that the study that I did was a grounded theory study, which is, grounded theories like to say is we try to create theory from data. And one of the hallmarks of the methodology is that we diagram in order to understand how a social process occurs. In this study, the social process was identity exploration. And so this was the model that resulted from the actual research around how is it that queer students of color explore their identities at historically white institutions. But for the purposes of this talk, I am going to focus on 4 key takeaways from the study. The first is that queer students of color explore their identities through a process of unlearning relative to systems of power. The scholars that I was in conversation with were, I don't even know if conversation is the best word, those who had set the foundation for identity exploration literature were these psychologists and social psychologists who were like these older white men, had talked about identity exploration as a process of learning, right? But for these students, it was not just learning new possibilities of being, but it was the unlearning as well that was extremely integral to their identity exploration. And that was because they had to unlearn all of these oppressive messages, ideologies that they had internalized because of their environments, because of their contexts. And so to explore their identities and to explore new ways of being, they also had to challenge and wrestle with the ways that they had been taught to feel, the ways that they had been taught to see themselves. The second point is that higher education influences our classes, our organizations, our policies can be positive or negative. And that sounds extremely reductive, but I'll go into a little bit more about what I mean by that. But the biggest thing that I like to communicate is that college campuses are not altogether positive in their influence and identity exploration. And that's important to say because I think I've talked to a lot of student affairs practitioners and faculty who see college as an absolute good, right? And as though it's perfect, it's untouchable. And what I like to hit home is that sometimes it was the communities outside of college, their college environments, that were the most formative for their exploration. And so recognizing that point as practitioners, as faculty, is extremely important to think about how we inform our practice moving forward. The third point is that access to other queer people of color spaces were the most kind of influential in their identity exploration. And that's extremely important to reflect on given our context, right? So I think about up a university so close to the border and thinking, where is it in the communities? Where are the communities where we can connect people to with other people who are queer people of color? And it was even more so influential if it was pertinent to their specific sexual, racial, and gender identities. And this last takeaway is that there was a major desire to develop a secure sense of self, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So this first point is that, if I were asked to succinctly describe how queer students of color explore their identities, my main thing is, it is this unlearning in relationship to oppressive systems, right? And as you discussed, there is substantial unlearning as it relates to 4 different dimensions. There's cognitive unlearning, there's behavioral unlearning, affective unlearning, and social unlearning. And so when we look at the identity exploration, the cognitive and behavioral are the ones that are oftentimes talked about. People learn new ways of thinking about themselves. People learn new ways of acting and behaving. But my research with queer students of color also brought to light these an affective dimension and a social dimension. And so what I mean by affective is as people were exploring their identities and as these, queer and trans people of color were coming to wrestle with questions of identity within college environments, they certainly had to go through this process of unlearning all the negative emotions that they had previously attached to these identities, right? So some of the conversation that we were having earlier around, the influence of religion, of the influence of conservative, socially conservative environments, right? These students and these individuals had come to associate emotions to the ways that they saw themselves. They had come to associate self-hate, trauma, shame, right, tied to their intersecting identities. And so in order to explore who they were, they also had to unlearn these affective components. And they also had to unlearn this feeling that they are the only one. And this is extremely common. As we discussed earlier, when it comes to, as social movements that frequently cater towards the majority within minoritized communities, people talked about, like, in my home spaces, my home communities, or with other communities of color, I feel ostracized because of my sexuality or my gender. And then when I'm with, queer and trans communities, I feel ostracized as a person of color. And then when I'm in cis het, white communities, I feel ostracized because all of it, right? Like, and so there was this unlearning of these feelings of being the only one. And concurrently, right, you're unlearning, but you're also learning. You're learning new ideas about identities, what is queerness, what are different groups within queer community, language, learning about systemic oppression, behaviorally, students got the opportunity to act on queer desires, perhaps for the first time, to be able to join different groups and search for people with similar identities. And if as you were unlearning self-hate, trauma, and shame, there was this learning of confusion, perhaps, but also healing, and experiencing perhaps pride and confidence in one's identities. And then, in unlearning the feeling of being the only one, they were learning the meaning of being part of a larger collective, whether it be, getting to connect with other queer and trans people of color in their spaces, or even just historicizing identity. There was a particular participant, Avery Demon, who discussed how when it learned that Frida Kahlo, for instance, was bisexual, that was a formative moment for them, because they were like, I am part of this larger history of queer people of color. And so that was an extremely important moment for them to acknowledge, right? I'm not the only one. And I'm not only not the only one right now in my current space, but also when I look through history, I see people who are like me. And I think that's extremely important for us who are teaching classes that talk about the history of our communities, right? And what that can do for our students. So one particular example that captures this unlearning process came from Richard, who was a queer Nepalese student in his 5th year. And he shared, I had to unlearn shame. Shame would be a big thing because you're conditioned, I think, by society and people from a young age that white is right, straight is great. I think that's what someone told me once. And it is unlearning all those self-harmful thoughts, like, this is bad, you shouldn't be like this. But for me, mostly it's not a matter of unlearning, it's a matter of learning more things too. Because I feel like I grew the more I learned. And it's been exploring stuff, learning more about myself, history and such, and being more me. And so Richard's quote, I think, poignantly captures a lot of what I just shared, right? You have Richard unlearning, these feelings associated with his identities, these messages that he'd received from people that white is right, straight is great, but also the importance of being able to learn, and in feeling as though, through this exploration, he was able to feel more at peace and as though he's learned about himself. The second takeaway I want to focus on was also, I think, captured through a participant when he said, I am what I am because of the institution I attend. And such a, short statement, but one that I think really speaks to, the importance of intentionally thinking about how we create our higher education environments in our college campuses, and the influence it can have on students. And in particular, these students were talking about the different practices, policies, and structures within their HWIs that influence their identity exploration. For instance, they talked about, noticing the funding for resource centers, culturally based student organizations, as well as academic programs, the lack of queer people of color, faculty and staff on campus, the centering or erasing of queer people of color in class content or in programming, and the university responses to bias incidents on campuses. And so what is important to note here is that, the connections that students made to how they understood and saw their identities. And so, for instance, there was a particular participant who, Oliver, who talked about how he noticed that they were cutting funding for the Mexican American Studies program at the institution. And that he noticed that, and he described it as, I'm seeing my institution cut funding for this particular program on campus. And what that communicates to me is that the institution, and discussed broadly, doesn't care about these groups. And consequently, what that also tells me is that if the institution doesn't care about these groups, that I then internalize a negative feeling about my identities because of that, right? And so how funding works at the institution, students were very cognizant of that, right? They saw funding being cut or not all there for the resources pertaining to their identities, which then influence how they thought about themselves. Something else I find important to note is, the centering or erasing of queer people of color in class content and programming. Avery, the participant that I mentioned earlier, Avery once said, there is only 1 week that I feel like it can be myself on campus. And that is when our LGBTQ Student Center and our Center for Multicultural Affairs, that typically does more work for racial and minoritized populations, do a programming together. And that was extremely hard to hear, right? To hear Avery say only 1 week where I feel like I can be myself. And that applied both to these student affairs offices, but also towards classes, right? Where, Ness was one participant who talked about a queer studies class in which they had also just a week on people of color. And too often, these students felt relegated to a week, right? They were consistently placed on the margins, even within spaces that are designed to center minoritized populations. And this was perhaps even worse in spaces that purported to not even talk about identity, or where identity didn't matter. And I'll touch upon that a little bit later as well. The third takeaway is the importance of, connections to other queer people of color. And I offer another quote from Richard. He shared that, like, how back in my day when I was in my Asian organizations, that was the main focus. And now when I'm surrounded by queer people, that is the main focus. The people around you, the places that you put yourself into are a huge identifier of which identity you're kind of going to be exploring. But also having things that help me explore both at the same time is similar in the same way. Being surrounded by queer Asian people really helps that out. I can relate with this and for one. And so the influence of queer people of color spaces is central for individuals. And this showed up very differently for different individuals based on their context. So at some institutions, especially the participants who are from smaller colleges and universities, it was amazing if they even had like a queer organization on campus, much less like a queer person of color organization. You know, I think for those of us who are at larger institutions, we frequently take like queer organizations or LGBTQ resource centers for granted, right? And for some at the smaller institutions, you know, they didn't have those resources. And so where did they go? They oftentimes went to like local organizations in the area, especially if they were near, you know, cities. But also, you know, if they weren't, then that was also a point of struggle, right? There was a person in the Mountain West who was like, the closest city was like 2 hours away. And it was like, yes, there are, you know, QPOC in those spaces, but to get there, it takes me 2 hours, and I can't do that when I'm navigating work, life, and in classes. People also mention, you know, associations, conferences, creating change is a queer centered conference, and a number of participants discussed. And I share this all to say that, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the most formative connections came off campuses. And so that is both a call for people out there to think about how is it that we can design resources for queer students of color on our own campuses, as well as a recognition that if that does not feel feasible, how is it that we're connecting with our communities, both, you know, around our spaces or beyond, and how are we connecting students to those communities as well? What awareness do you have of those resources? And are you able to help students make those connections when they may or may not be present on your own campuses? And the last point is I'd just like to share kind of the hopes that the participants disclosed. You know, time and time again, when I would ask students what is their what do they hope and desire as a result of exploring their identities, they mentioned this wanting to develop a secure sense of self, you know, that did not internalize systemic oppressive influences, but that also knew how to resist oppressive influences. And they felt like this responsibility to do so for other queer people of color. You know, Dash just said, you know, I think my forever thing is to be able to find a secure sense of who I am without letting anyone care. Like my goal is to always be someone who myself likes and not worry about what others think or what others are trying to push onto me, and being able to stand strong in that. You know, I think by exploring both identities, I can do that because as I accept them more and move through them more, they're not things that nag me, they're just things that I become more proud of. And so I find this necessary to highlight because, you know, exploration is extremely important. And so if we do not have these opportunities or do not create these opportunities for people to explore, you know, I think that's a huge disservice to our the students that we work with, the students that we interact with. And so to be thinking about where within our sphere of influence can we create these opportunities for people to explore, such that we may be able to help them develop this secure sense of self. And, you know, I think there's questions as to whether or not a secure sense of self is ever possible in a society that will always thrive on and perpetuate white supremacy, heterosexism, trans oppression, and other forms of oppression. But at the same time, our students are striving toward it and are desiring it. And so before I open up time for more questions and answers, I do want to maybe begin by offering some major implications, I think, of this work, and we'll be interested to hear others' take on this. So feel free to once again put in questions, answers, or thoughts in the chat function. So the three main implications that I offer are one, creating spaces mindful of intersecting identities, rejecting the idea of identity neutral spaces. Some of my recent work has started going into STEM spaces, and there's lots of work to be done in STEM. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I've discussed time and time again, knowing your resources. And so when I talk about creating spaces mindful of intersecting identities, I like to pull on this idea that Kimberly Crenshaw offers around conducting an intersectional audit. And I have 4 main questions that we can reflect on. The first is, when approaching conversations with students, what assumptions am I operating from, and how are these assumptions themselves rooted in privilege? So for instance, on a lot of college campuses, we celebrate National Coming Out Day. And that is an opportunity to, show people that there are others who identify as part of the queer and trans community. And yet, myself and other scholars who do work around queer and trans people of color question the notion of coming out. Because what we know for people of color and communities of color, coming out may not be possible, right? Due to questions of safety, finances, so on and so forth, nor may it be desirable, right? To actualize one's queer or trans identity, you don't have to disclose this part of yourself to certain communities or to any communities. And so I'm not advocating against National Coming Out Day programming, but what I am saying is that we need to be very cognizant of what that does and for whom is this programming for. I know that was a question a little bit earlier on around like, how does coming out look, differently for these communities, and just this idea of the difficulty of students / family coming out. And so that's one way that we can challenge it. The second question is, what opportunities do people with multiple minoritized identities have to connect, right? Are we creating spaces within our organizations, within our academic programs, especially our academic programs that are centered around identities, communities, and movements? What are the opportunities that they have to meet with one another? And also recognizing, yes, it's, identity and the connections we make about identity will always be layered, right? So I can connect with another queer person, even if they're white. When I meet another queer person of color, we perhaps have more in common. But when I'm able to talk with, another queer Mexican person, those conversations become very rich. And so just thinking about how is it that we make these spaces and connections complex. And also not assuming that just because 2 people identify as queer, people of color, or even queer people of color, that they will have commonalities. I'm frequently thinking about who's represented in spaces, who are our faculty, who are our staff, and what is the work that we do in order to recruit and retain faculty and staff who can become possibility models. And so that is extremely important, for a lot of students here at Auburn, which is located in Alabama. They've mentioned to me that I'm the first, queer faculty member that they've had ever disclose their queerness. They've also mentioned that I'm some of their first Latino faculty, and inevitably, right, that means I'm probably the first queer Latino faculty member that they've had. And so what is the work that we can do in terms of help creating possibility models for our students, while at the same time doing the necessary work on the back end, making sure that we are actually doing what we need to recruit and retain these faculty and staff. And the last question is, how are other spaces unwelcoming towards those with multiple minoritized identities? And so, yes, spaces, for example, like queer people of color organizations or, coffee chats within academic programs is important. And that doesn't also put us off the hook in terms of thinking about how all the other spaces around it are maybe unwelcoming toward those with multiple minoritized identities. And so, I offer this example of like an LGBTQ center can have a queer person of color organization, but that doesn't mean that the LGBTQ center itself may still not be replicating, whiteness and white supremacy and ableism. And so even though singular spaces to create relationships are important and necessary, doing the work of interrogating what is happening everywhere else is still equally necessary. So it's both and, right? Like we can have these resources and these services in the meantime, but we also have to be critical about what is present on the outside. So, first thing I want to say is there's no such thing as an identity neutral space. This was very salient for the students who were in STEM disciplines and in non-identity based student affairs offices. They would say that like they would have faculty who would state, well, it doesn't matter to me. It shouldn't matter that you're a person of color in STEM. It shouldn't matter that you're queer in STEM. And of course, what we know from the research, we know from our practice, of course it matters, right? Like this is why people aren't retained in STEM or don't see themselves as being able to be in STEM. And so I asked them questions around like, if you're in these spaces that aren't, centered around social identities explicitly, are you still having conversations of how identities play a role in your particular contexts? And also who is being called upon to speak about minoritized communities, right? Like I've seen panels of, being out in the workforce and it's all like white, cis, gay men. And so naming how we oftentimes, once again, default to the majority within minoritized groups. And so troubling who we're inviting to talk about these minoritized communities. And are you using examples of incorporating people who hold multiple minoritized identities in your work? And the last thing is, know your resources. As discussed, one of the hardest things of having of this research is always talking about learning about the self-hate, about the trauma, about the shame that people go through. And it's hard because I never want people to experience that. It's also hard because I went through those same experiences or similar experiences. And so how is it that we're able to connect students to these resources, these counseling services that are identity conscious, right? Like there are actually different websites and that are designed to create networks of that people can search for, like queer and trans people of color therapists. And so I always, is that a possibility? But also recognizing that is also like a financial privilege, thinking about insurance and all of that. And so on or off campus, do you know if your students have access to identity conscious counseling? And how do you continue to connect students to different resources? Are there associations, conferences, other spaces that people can be attending, right? Like, are we connecting them to like AHAS, for instance? So where are the places that we can help people, explore who they are? Is always really important. So take stock of whether or not you have idea of resources and communities around you that you might be able to connect students with as another exercise to think about as you're supporting, queer and trans people of color. So all of these stories can be found in this book that was released last year. What I do like to say, it's hardback or e-copy right now. The paperback should be released, I think, at the end of this year. So it's pricey. So don't buy the hardback or the e-copy. But in case you want to, it's there out there. That being said, I'm always just happy to talk more about these stories without it, but just wanted to make you aware the book is out there. But with that, I do want to leave ample time for questions and conversation. I do, always say, if you want to follow up on any of these pieces, please do feel free. You can find me on Twitter. I try to be hip and with the times and socially media adept, but I can also be reached via email as well. And so always welcome, further conversation, questions, or any additional comments. And with that, I will stop sharing, but looking forward to the questions that come on in.
That was fabulous. I really want to buy your book now, even though it's a little expensive. But I'll buy it.
That's what I'm saying. Not the hard copy. Wait for the paperback. Wait for the paperback.
I'll buy it for Chicano programs. Thank you so much, Antonio. This was phenomenal, and it really touched on other themes that have been brought up by other speakers. There is a comment. We were joined by Dr. Ann Goodman, who is the Dean of Students here at NMSU, and she left you this message. The whole presentation has been great. Wish I could stay longer. I hope that can continue this work conversation on campus. Thanks to everyone who made this program possible. And there is a question from Daniel Gonzalez. How can these intersections be considered in research that is not focused on an identity?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, this research is specifically around identity development. But that being said, the experiences of queer and trans people of color, I mean, there's so much to be understood and understood when it comes to the structural barriers that queer and trans people of color face, right? There's a whole line of research in, for example, in our counseling fields and our mental health fields around minority stress and the ways that minority stress is multiplied or experienced in higher degrees by those who hold multiple minoritized identities. I have also been thinking largely too around how this work can be translated into policy areas. I'm thinking especially as it relates to, health insurance, thinking about issues around basic needs and security. All of these areas are places where, unfortunately, what we do have is we know that queer and trans people of color experience these things at higher, rates, like basic needs and security, like issues around housing insecurity as well, and sexual assault. And, this work really just permeates a lot of fields. And so I think we always have to be mindful of the intersections of identity and how, overlapping systems of oppression shape the structural conditions in which people inhabit in order to think about effecting change within our communities. That's a great question. And I hope that answered it, Danielle out in the audience. But of course, happy to think about other questions or thoughts.
So you mentioned that your family is from this borderlands region, from Ciudad Juarez. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What parallels do you draw, if any, between borderlands identity and the work that you're doing, and how can we, I guess, learn more about that, like the parallels between that and the work that we need to do, especially at this institution? Dr. Dulcinea Lara created over a long time the Borderlands and Ethnic Studies graduate certificate. So the importance of Borderlands identity, gender and sexuality studies, and ethnic studies, especially for places like this one, where we don't have such programs established or institutionalized as they should be.
Yeah, for sure. I had the great pleasure recently to work with Dr. Fernando Rodriguez and Dr. Oscar Patron, and to think about, because Dr. Rodriguez's work was actually his research was on gay Latino men at an HSI on the borderlands. And we had, you know, numerous conversations around the experiences of these students, especially because, you know, many of them were in Mexico and would travel to the university in the across the border. And the dissonance that sometimes would result from that, of, you know, and feeling like inhabiting different selves. So one participant referred to themselves as like the Hannah Montana, like a Hannah Montana, right? If anyone's familiar with Hannah Montana, that was like a Disney Channel show of like a girl who was a famous pop star, but no one knew she was a famous pop star, and she would just go to school and no one knew that. And so someone connected that idea to the ways that they felt, right? Like on campus at my institution, I feel that I'm like this person, and then when I go back home, I'm this other completely different person, and that is hard. And so I think we, within these contexts, have to be very mindful of like, how do we help support students through that experience while at the same time not shaming them for that. I've met too many well-intentioned professionals and faculty who see coming out, to see this like very white idea of living out queer identities as the only way of living out identities. And that's just not possible for some people. And once again, nor is that desirable. And so I do think about like, how is it that we help people navigate their selves in these different spaces, and how do we not see that as deficit, and how do we see that as okay, right, and as its own sort of beauty. And I also see this question around like, where do participants find strength overcoming negative experiences, and that oftentimes happen with these queer and trans people of color communities. And that's why, you know, I find it to be such an important and influential experience. You know, there was one participant who, you know, specifically talked about like, they had a friend group who was all queer, like queer and trans people of color. And they were like, it's beautiful to just go with people and, you know, not be questioned, not be challenged, right? To just hear like this stuff happen, and it was extremely like upped. I'm gonna bleep myself, and to also feel like I just could be with them. And so, you know, yes, I'm not saying that like we can't support our students who don't, if we don't inhabit these identities. And, you know, those connections with people who hold these similar identities were extremely formative for people, especially when they had struggled finding others who were like them for so long. And so it's through community, through connection, that I think participants found their strength, found their beauty, found their pride, found their confidence. And it was really, I think, amazing to see. Because yes, queer and trans people of color navigate a lot of structural barriers, both in and outside of higher education. And yet they're resilient, they're agentic, right? And so that is always something important to highlight as well, Damien. Yes, I see another question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. It's very inspiring and illuminating what you shared. You know, this little group here, we're calling ourselves the Pluriversity Imagination Collective, and thinking outside of uni and really thinking about the plural, right? And in kind of thinking about which speakers do we want to bring in the spring as our inaugural year, we invited scholars who inhabit multiple identities in multiple contexts, multiple ways. And one of the things that emerged was we invited scholars, some who are in institutions of higher education, HSIs, PWIs, and some who are not affiliated with institutions, who are doing critical knowledge making work in collective with community outside the institution for various reasons of not yet being hired or being hired and leaving their institutions. And so like, I think my question for you is, you know, as a scholar who's looking at higher education, what is the potential for institutions changing, for institutions becoming open, becoming pluralistic, institutions that have been very stable for a long time? What do you see in your research, and where's the potential, where's the hope?
Yeah, I think there is tremendous hope, and I always have to balance that for sure. Of like, how do we balance recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, that our colleges and universities, right, have always existed on in perpetuating anti-Blackness, right, and in perpetuating, queer and trans antagonism. Like that was their inception in the United States. Like we can never avoid that, and that those legacies are still very much so present today. And yet, at the same time, how do we imagine a new way of being within our institutions? And I think that only starts when we center those with multiple minoritized identities. So how is it that we no longer, relegate queer communities to a 1 week in a class? Like, what would it look like to start our syllabi explicitly centering, queer and trans people, people with disabilities, and so it's for me like a reshifting of who is put on in the center, and that goes for like the ways that we think about our classes, the ways that we think about our resources, and I think that's probably the hardest conversation to have is around the budgets and how institutions function, because I and other, I think, higher ed scholars say is like, show me an institution's budget and I'll show you what the institution values. And I think that is the thing that's probably going to have to really change is how is it that we dedicate resources and funding for those with multiple minoritized identities? Yeah, football jumbotrons are the ones that are valued and not our students. And so it can do, I can see the work happening in small spaces in the ways that we have agency over, but I do think there needs to be this collective, reimagining of an institution, especially as it relates to resources, in order for this work to continue moving forward. Yeah, thank you. I do see a few other questions. The first being, what new questions and curiosities came up when interviewing these students that you might think about queer students of color in the university. I am very interested in how institutions are racialized, especially as we think about minority serving institutions. And so my next project is going to take a little bit more of a concerted look at different institutional types and really interrogating, in what ways do HBCUs versus, HSIs versus HWIs shape questions of identity more? Because, when I think about, the college student development research and, a lot of the conversations we have in higher ed spaces, we start at the point of predominantly white institutions, and we don't go far beyond that. And so that is something I'm extremely curious about. I'm also extremely curious about where students take the lessons and knowledge gained from the institution after. And so this project that I'm mentioning is the hope is going to be longitudinal, meaning that it will occur throughout time. And so I want to follow students after to make sense of how is it that the college environment shaped their journeys post them leaving higher education. And so lots to be unpacked there. There's this question around, you all are hiring a vice president for equity and inclusion and diversity. maybe. This advice, what would the advice be of the first most important step to take to facilitate the identity of queer students of color? Oof, that's a intense question. I think the most important step would be to learn from the communities that are present within the institution about what they need and actually make it happen. I always feel for people who are in these chief diversity officer roles about the difficult point that one is put in order to do the work of facilitating diversity on campus while at the same time being beholden to university stakeholders. Like, I acknowledge that's the reality of the ways that these people are put in. And so for me, it is, really listening to what communities on your campus want, while at the same time knowing that if you're going to listen to them, I hope that you're going to do something with the information. Because I think one of the hardest things is when people come into these communities, like queer communities of color, ask what they need and then leave and never come back. And so how is it that you're able to be on the ground with the people that you're serving, and also how is it that you complete the loop, for me, is what is important to kind of note. And the last question that I have on the is around, like, have you ever thought about turning your research student stories into a QPOC anthology that can be used in different courses to build community? That's beautiful. That's so beautiful. Yes. Thank you for that question and really that thought. That's a great idea. I also want to be very mindful of working with other, people who have been doing this work in other disciplines, and so who have already been doing some really amazing work of uplifting queer people of color. And so I'm gonna marinate on that and what that could look like, and what that could look like in community with other queer scholars of color.
Dr. Cook has her hand up.
Okay, so you were talking about some interesting kind of applications of what you're doing. We're doing something that's kind of similar. Some of us at NMSU and some other folks in the community are working to create health resources for trans and non-binary folks, hopefully eventually getting a clinic up and running, which of course that first starts with a very important and meaningful needs assessment, right? And we know that trans and non-binary folks across the country have real barriers to healthcare, starting with discrimination, issues of poverty, etc. And one of those issues is also the issue of race. So we're going to be hearing from voices of trans and non-binary people of color. How do you think? Do you have any kind of just a general advice for us in beginning this very important research that just stems on so many forms of oppression and pain, literally physical, psychological, you name it, right? Any advice for us in starting this project?
That's first of all, that's amazing that is happening, and I'm so happy to hear it. I think the advice that I would offer, and the same kind of advice that I give myself, especially when working alongside these communities, is compensation and follow through. Like, how do we compensate people for their time and energy, and also what resources are we able to have for them after we do this kind of initial kind of data collection. That's something that I've struggled with as a researcher, is at times it feels like I'm collecting people's stories and then I'm the one who benefits from them. And so for me, it's like, how do I stay in community with individuals after a particular study intervention ends, and how do I continue giving in the ways that I can, right? And so how is it that you can uplift the work of this amazing initiative and then also continue hearing what the community needs is something that I would think about. But that sounds amazing, and I know that you all will have a major impact.
Thank you. I like your answer. Gave us some very real material things we can work on. Really appreciate that.
And I appreciate the nudge to schedule that meeting, Sophia. Got it. I'll do it right after this. Muchísimas gracias, Antonio. I do want to turn it over to Drs. Lara and Badoni or Hamze. Any of you who wish to say something as we wrap up? We will end at 5:30, so I'm mindful of the time difference for you, Antonio.
I'll just jump in and just thank you once again. This has been a really amazing effort this spring to bring critical dialogue to our institution that really needs a push and really needs the words that you're offering that seem very reasonable and common sense to you. It's like we're really grappling with that here, especially in the borderlands context and at this institution. So I just want to thank you and kind of, you know, what you've talked about today. I was taking notes. There's a lot of the theme that I've seen with the speakers this spring is self-determination, right? The idea, especially in a university like ours, is come to this institution, a land grant, Hispanic serving, and learn about yourself. And I feel like we're kind of pushing that further to talk about self-determination, self-knowledge, and how do we as a learning community understand where people are coming from in all the different intersectional ways and all the different celebratory ways to really create community. So thank you so much for being part of this spring series. And we're hoping to maybe get all our speakers in dialogue together in the fall on a panel, because I would love to see you all engaging each other. And so just stay tuned. Hopefully we'll reach out to you for that. But again, thank you so much for sharing today. And we hope to have you here in person one day too. That would be fantastic.
No, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you all for the invitation, and would certainly love to continue the conversation, especially thinking about the context that you all are situated. I'm actually transitioning to an HSI in the fall. And so especially as it relates to thinking about this work at HSIs, yes, I would love to imagine together.
Dr. Duran, thank you very much. We would still want to collaborate with you if you go to an HSI next fall, so that we can learn together and imagine a different learning higher education space. Thank you very much. And as a queer person of color, I'm queer Palestinian, speaking to you from the borderlands, actually, of Palestine, Jordan right now. And you really provoked me to think more of what it means also to Palestinian queers here, and how coming out is not an option sometimes to them, yet they are figuring out their ways of being in this world with dignity. So thank you so much, Dr. Duran. Yeah.
Sophia, Gina.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you. I am in higher ed now, but my previous, I'm sorry, I've got kids and family all around me. But I just wanted to thank you for your work and your contribution to the work that we're trying to move forward for our own students and our work at NMSU. Yeah, so I was a K-12 educator before, but mostly in tribal communities. So I know a little bit of just what happened on reservations and for our Native students in that capacity. But thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us today, and we will continue to embrace that work and move it forward as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you on behalf of our students as well. We saw a lot of excitement about this event. absolutely great job. We really do want to keep in contact with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio, Dr. Duran. It's been great, a lot to think about, and we hope to see you very soon in person. There is a comment from Daniel saying mil gracias to you, and I just want to reiterate our gratitude for your fabulous presentation, and go and order Dr. Duran's book if you can afford it. If not, come to Chicana Programs and check it out. Let's discuss it. And again, muchísimas gracias, and we will be in touch with you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias. Adiós.
Adiós.